Hey guys, Tyler here. In prior Star Trek videos, I've explored various aspects of the Mirror universe. First seen in the original series episode Mirror Mirror and featured in multiple episodes of Deep Space Nine and Enterprise and Discovery, the Mirror universe is home to the Terran Empire, a brutal, xenophobic, fascistic counterpart to the United Federation of Planets. Mirror humans, Terrans, exhibit negative personality traits and ambitions that mirror the noble, peaceful, and diplomatic traits of their Prime Universe counterparts. In the first episode of this mini-series, I dove into the science of the Mirror universe, using quantum field theory to analyze its relation with the Prime Universe. In the follow-up video, I dispelled what I believe are some misconceptions surrounding the Terran Empire's origins, that it's a literal continuation of Rome or a descendant of the Third Reich, that sort of thing. In this video, I'll argue for another alternative explanation that is admittedly just as speculative, but is intriguing to me nonetheless, that the Terran Empire began as a mirror universe version of the United States. Upon reflection of the nature of the Mirror universe, it becomes clear that its historical differences could date back centuries or even millennia. This could explain how Terrans harbor more aggressive tendencies on the aggregate, but the specific history of their empire could have a more recent origin. Although the empire obviously exhibits callbacks to Roman iconography and the like, a personal favorite theory of mine is that the Terran Empire is an outgrowth of American imperialism. Now, before you go raging in the comments, just stick with me here. I know that putting American and imperialism in the same sentence can kind of set some people off, but hear me out. Once upon a time, there was a king named George Washington. I'm just kidding, Washington was never formally offered the chance to become a king, although some in the population at the time did entertain the idea of a constitutional monarchy. No, I think it's actually more interesting to consider what might have happened if America took a different turn later, say in the mid-20th century. Jonathan Archer claims in A Mirror Darkly that the Terran Empire is at least this old, although it could be older. But one could argue that the seeds for something like the Terran Empire were planted in the period between the world wars. If we do take claims about the Empire's age at face value, then it must be descended from an Earth political unit that existed no later than the 1950s. This is supported by images seen in the alternate opening title sequence for In a Mirror Darkly, showcasing the history of human warfare. Included among these images is a Terran insignia superimposed over a clip of American soldiers marching into Paris, and a clip of an astronaut planting a Terran Empire flag on the moon. This latter image is shown chronologically between the launch of the Saturn V and the launch of the Phoenix in 2063. Curiously, the astronaut is wearing an EV suit that is identical to the ones worn by Starfleet officers in the 22nd century, meaning that either this was a later landing than 1969, or the VFX team used the same EV suit model for the title sequence because it was cheaper. Both could be true, but I tend to think that the latter is the overarching explanation. But how could this empire have arisen as a result of an Axis defeat in World War II? Well, as I've hinted at in this video, for centuries the US has engaged in what is euphemistically called world policing. The Monroe Doctrine, our rejection of European interference in the Western Hemisphere, followed by the Roosevelt Corollary, and our numerous land annexations have all laid the groundwork for the US to become a world hegemon. While some might think it's wrong to characterize America as an empire because we don't have a monarchy, think again. Remember, Rome was a republic after all, and so is France, which still has overseas holdings from its colonial empire, and so on. But the form of domination that the US and other Western countries have engaged in for the past half century or so usually takes on a more economic angle than anything else, than actually annexing territories and incorporating them into the United States. Think international corporations using their power and influence, often with the implicit or even explicit consent of their home governments to buy exclusivity rights to mine minerals and other natural resources in poorer nations. This is a major component of modern free market capitalism. And the merging of corporations with the state, as Mussolini defined it, is fascism. There have been outright fascist movements in American history, although none of them really gained that much electoral traction. Without getting bogged down into today's politics, some of the most recent iterations of fascist plots against the federal government were often directed at the Roosevelt administration, including the failed so-called business plot in the 1930s, as well as Charles Lindbergh's America First movement. Okay, this is all well and good, but it's still kind of a vague picture. Indeed, for all of America's hegemonic practices, in the post-war era, many of its occupations of other countries led to those countries becoming independent liberal democracies. Now, it's sort of a different story today, with US interventions in places like Iraq or Afghanistan formerly, and various African countries, effectively becoming semi-permanent occupations, even if liberation from injustice is used as a pretext. This would work fine if we view the Terran Empire as an outgrowth of America's current imperialistic practices. But again, if we take the age of the Terran Empire at face value, then we have to go back to the 1950s. The US has a history of annexing and occupying foreign lands in the name of spreading Republican values. And as I discussed in my previous Mirror Universe video, what we call the Enlightenment could have still happened in the Mirror Universe, although with a different outcome. But regarding World War II specifically, during the war, the Allied powers actually bounced around different ideas for what a post-war New World Order would look like. The international order that we ended up with, the US spearheading the United Nations for diplomatic endeavors and NATO for defense against the Soviet Union, is still in place today. Some of this would still exist in the Mirror Universe. We know, once again, from the opening titles of In a Mirror Darkly, that something akin to the space race and the Cold War still occurred on the other side. But Tyler, I hear you screaming incessantly, what does this have to do with the Terran Empire? Why are we talking about the Cold War? I'm getting to that. I mentioned a phrase earlier, New World Order. These three words have been used in widely varying contexts throughout history, including by members of the Baha'i religion, Nazis, anti-fascists, science fiction writers, Pat Robertson. It's even on the United States dollar bill. It's a phrase that conspiracy theorists often latch onto, making connections with the Freemasons of yore, or various anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. But one work where the phrase is used in perhaps a more benign context is a map published by amateur artist Maurice Gomberg in 1942. Gomberg, a Polish-Jewish immigrant from Philadelphia, created the so-called outline of the post-war New World map as a personal project. Little is known about Gomberg, and beyond the shadow of a doubt, he almost certainly had no connections to anyone in the US government, or any government for that matter. The map depicts the world divided into multiple super-states, not dissimilar from those in George Orwell's 1984. The new borders include a US that has taken over the entire North American continent, united federations in Africa, Europe, and South America, a consolidated British Commonwealth, a greatly expanded USSR, quarantined Axis nations, and more. The map has, of course, been circulated online for many years and has been referenced by some conspiracy theorists as being indicative of serious plans for a reorganization of the world in the case of an Allied victory. But obviously, much of what's on this map did not come to pass. Many have noted that Gomberg's map is actually indicative of a sort of naive optimism about an Allied victory scenario, since the USSR was one of the Allied powers. But below the map's reimagining of the world's borders is a 41-point manifesto. Here we go. The manifesto, inspired in part by Franklin D. Roosevelt's For Freedom speech, calls for a number of radical changes, including the expulsion of all ethnically Japanese people from the United States. Yeah, I didn't say it wasn't racist, but the map, despite its exact configuration being sort of laughable, actually really laughable, did get me thinking. What if in the mirror universe, the United States actually did enact some sort of radical plan to bring about a new world order? If we assume that this alternate United States is more authoritarian to begin with, then there's a number of changes that we could see unfold over time. Perhaps FDR's reputation as a benevolent dictator in the Prime universe takes on a more literal shape on the other side. Perhaps he's some sort of Julius Caesar type expansionist leader. He is, after all, commander-in-chief of the largest and most powerful military in the world. After winning the hearts and minds of those at home in the Republic with its New Deal reforms, the administration could take a more paternalistic approach to defense of the Western Hemisphere and continental Europe. This is the US that would have fewer qualms about semi-permanent occupations of places like the Caribbean, Greenland, Iceland, Germany, Japan, Korea, the Middle East, Indochina, and more. Lest you think this projection of military power abroad would make us safer, think again. Historically, many of our interventions have been less about spreading freedom and more so about protecting the interests of oil companies and defense contractors. This is not an anti-America rant, mind you, but this American empire, which is only shades different from America in real life, would have to compromise its morals in order to sustain itself. Whether the name Terran Empire is actually in use by the 1950s is completely irrelevant. The American empire would transform the world in its image. Any pretext about the Cold War being a fight to preserve liberal democracy could be shed entirely. It would center even more on the ideological battle between communism and capitalism, with proxy conflicts to control resources continuing even after the fall of the Soviet Union, if it still falls. The culture of this alternate American empire need not even really mimic that of the totalitarian regimes that we defeated in World War II. Indeed, as I mentioned in the previous Mirror Universe video, the Terrans' selfishness could be seen as a hyper-individualist attitude rooted in an extreme reading of Enlightenment philosophy. One could imagine the empire's society being even more dominated by private interests than the real world is. This is not at all incompatible with the sort of fascism that characterizes the Terran Empire and is frankly emergent in the West today. The parallels are hard to ignore. People being stripped of their constitutional rights, the internet becoming increasingly controlled by cartels and monitored by government agencies, and education becoming more dominated by propaganda. All of this while the military conducts operations overseas in the name of anti-terrorism. Eventually, by the 2050s, this Western-dominated empire would defeat the ECON and absorb those nations into its fold, eventually culminating in what we see in a Mirror Darkly and beyond. All of this is entirely speculative, of course. I'm only mentioning a lot of these connections because of what's suggested in the In a Mirror Darkly opening titles. But I think it's fun to imagine what might have happened if the post-World War II order spearheaded by the United States had taken a darker path, possibly with some encouragement from a more cynical outlook at the time of the nation's founding. With differences dating back centuries or even millennia, it's not easy to tell when and where the Prime and Mirror universes actually diverged. In fact, in my first video about the Mirror universe, I basically came to the conclusion that they've likely always been separate, but due to some mechanism that links them cosmically, like the mycelial network.
The mycelial network is like
mycelial network! They reflect each other in mysterious ways, with many of the same people and places and ships having counterparts in both timelines. I do think it's more interesting to think of Terrans as being humans who have simply adapted to different cultural circumstances, rather than being a distinct species, as Discovery keeps trying to hint at, since the former means that any one of us could be Terrans should we be born in their universe. In this respect, I actually think that the Deep Space Nine crossover episodes are more interesting from a characterization standpoint. And while I think it's cool that Discovery has sort of added to the lore about the Mirror universe, it's not as narratively satisfying, in my opinion. But what do you think? Let me know down in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching. I know I made some claims in this video, and I know that there are going to be political discussion in the comments section, so please keep it civil. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to leave a thumbs up down below and don't forget to share it. That stuff really helps me out. If you haven't subscribed yet, be sure to do that as well so you won't miss future uploads, and click the bell icon to receive all notifications. If you think I deserve it and you want to support the channel even further, becoming a patron or a member is a great way to do so. Links to those, as well as my social media and merch store, are in the description below. That's all I have for this week. Live long and prosper.